we're now going to create a control system for our arm. I don't have my IK for it, and we need to create a RP solver for our arm. So if I go into my settings for my IK, I can see I'm in RP mode. I'm going to show you how to identify if you're in RP or SC, after you create a control. So I'm actually going to find my arm, and instead of actually trying to select them inside my joint, because the wrists are right on top of each other, the end of my arm and the wrist, and my clavicle and my shoulder, my root of the arm, are a little bit difficult to identify. So I'm going to click my first joint. Now I am in IK mode. I'm going to hold down Command and select the third joint. And there it goes. Now make sure you're doing Command, not Shift. That will not actually properly create the IKs. Okay, so I got my RP. So how do I know this is an RP solver? That if I look at my IK handle and I look down, you can see that under inputs it says RP, where I do have my shoulder one in here, which I create as an SC, and it says SC. Okay, so I got my controls in here. I'm going to call this my left arm IK, and this one should be clavicle, and it is. And if you didn't already create this, this is just a single chain IK from our root of our clavicle to the end. Now that we have our IK, we need to make some type of controls to manipulate this. I particularly like cubes to deal with translation. If you always use those type of objects or rigid objects like squares and cubes, that the animator will always know, hey, that's something that's supposed to be translated. Where we do rings and spheres, those are things that are meant to be rotated. So I'm going to duplicate our cube here, and I'm just going to move it on top of the hand. That. It's not right on top of it, so let's scale it down. See, snap it right there. Okay, good. It's right on top of it. Okay, so this is going to be our left arm icon, since it's the only, there's not going to be a control right on top of it that's going to mimic for the FK system for this. So this is left arm icon is fine. We do need to freeze transforms and delete history on it. We don't want to center pivot, even though in this case it wouldn't be a big deal. So we do want it to control, because we want to make a control that's manipulating the IK, and the IK point stops right here. That's why we're creating control with our pivot point right there. So our shoulder is going to be similar. I'm going to take this arrow and duplicate it, and we're not making a cube because it's going to intersect with the character, and I'm just going to snap it right on top of the joint. Okay. I can rotate it down. I'm just going to rotate it 90 and translate it up like this. Scale it down a little bit, maybe elongate it like that. And then what I can do is I can rotate it into kind of like it's pointing to the shoulder like that. Okay, now we have a kind of a design decision here, and this is that, do we want the pivot point on the actual joint? Like if I type in D and V and then snap my pivot point right on the shoulder, I can do that, but every time the animator wants to move this, they're going to have to actually move it from inside the geometry, and I'm not really a big fan of that. Now remember, we're only translating this control, so that we're not going to actually have a lot of problems with if the offset's on. Now if we're dealing with rotation and it would rotate around this control, that would be a big issue. But it's an IK system, it's translation. So I could leave my pivot point back to where it was, maybe move it down to like the tip. If I hold down D and then C actually snaps to curves, and I move it down like that. So it's at the bottom of the pointer. That might be better. So in this case, I could freeze transforms and delete history on this control and call this my left clav icon. And this will control that system. Now I normally don't want to do that for the arm, because I could select anywhere around here, and it's not a lot that you're going inside the geometry here. So this actually makes sense, but on here, because you do have a lot of complexity here, putting our pivot point up here does not hurt it. So the last one we want to do is we want to make an elbow control. So I'm just going to duplicate my arrow again, and I'm going to snap this right on the arm. So the difference here is that with this control, this is an aiming mechanism. So if I translate this away, and I normally like rotate it down just a tad like that. Now what I did is I snapped it right to the elbow, and then I rotated away from it. This is an aiming system. It's not actually meant to rotate or manipulate directly on the joint. So if we do our pole vector and we have our pivot point right on the arm, it's actually going to cause it to flip because it's like aiming like darts right in front of your face. So we want it to be pointed pretty decently far away. We could do the same thing here where I can do D and then C and snap to our pivot point here. Okay, I freeze transforms and delete history on that. I'm going to call this my left. And this is going to be my elbow icon. There we go. Now we're ready to get these systems set up. Now, the nice thing here is this IK is a control system. It's not a joint. So if it's a control system, it's perfectly legal to take a control and parent it to another control. So I can just say shift select. I have my IK first, and I can shift select my control and hit P for parent, and that is working. And we have a clean value on our control, and this is fine. And the reason is because this is a control. It's not actually a joint. Now, I just undid that, or actually I'm going to unparent it. Here's my control. I'm going to unparent that. I can middle mouse drag it out, or I can hit Shift P to do that. Okay, the next way I can do this is instead of actually parenting directly, I can use a parent constraint. Now, normally you don't use parent constraints from control to control, but from control to IK, since you're never going to be animating the IK directly, doing a constraint's fine. And what the constraint does, it allows you to make your group with all the IKs. Because if I parent these, now you have to find the control that has the IK on it to manipulate it. Where when I actually constrain it, I can have them all in one central location. I'm going to show you that. So if I select my control, and then I shift select, this, my control is my driver, and I shift select my driven, which is the IK, and I say constraint, and I go into my constraint menu. On this case, the offset's fine here. So I hit apply. You'll notice now that it does work, but our IK is not underneath our joint. So I could do this with our shoulder control. So I select my shoulder and I shift select my IK, and I can say constraint, since it was last settings, and this will manipulate our shoulder, and our IK is working. That's fine. And you can see now I could actually group together my IKs into my like IK group, something like that. I really prefer, instead of doing the constraints, I prefer actually using just parenting them, because it's a little more stable, and it's mainly it. It's a little bit more stable on connecting, because sometimes when you undo your constraints, it doesn't go right back to where it is. You have to jiggle a control to have it snap. So in this case, it's more of up to your preference onto it. I am going to parent them under the actual IK, the actual controls themselves. So I'm just going to take my arm and put it on my arm, and my clavicle and put it on my clavicle. I'm going to get rid of this group. It also groups itself together properly because you're moving the hierarchy with parenting. So now I can move my control here and here. Okay, and the final one is our pole vector. And the pole vector is literally, we're going to select our control and then shift select our IK, and we're going to do the pole vector constraint. So same driver driven as every other one of the constraints. There's no offset settings here. It's just, that's all it is. I apply it, and now you can see when I move my arm up and down, the arm moves. See? If you try to apply this and it gives you an error and says you can't do a pole vector on that type of IK solver, check to make sure, select your IK, and check to make sure you have a RP solver, not an SE solver. And that's pretty much setting up the arm. We're not going to parent these systems together. They're going to be floating, and they're not going to be connected to the shoulder, because when you lift your shoulder up, you don't have to lift your arms up. So this system is pretty much finished.